So first of all, good day to everyone. Thanks for joining us over here on the AIFL webinar where we're partnering with IsraAID, dedicated to providing a direct field update from the Bahamas, what's happening over there and how things looking. We over here at the America-Israel Friendship League are excited to sponsor this webinar. This is exactly the kind of outreach of information that we are promoting. We've been around basically since 1971, and our focus has always been on promoting the relationship between the people of Israel and those of the United States through enhancing the familiarity with what Israel is and what are some of the great things and inspiring things that come from there. Today, we are continuing with our series of webinars dedicated to sharing this vision. 6 months ago, I was introduced to IsraAID, an organization dedicated. It has developed in Israel to help those in need in disaster-struck areas around the world. And when I was tasked about whether we should somehow get our organization to work together, it was a no-brainer. It was clear that working with IsraAID would serve a dual purpose. We would be spreading word of some of the great things that come out of Israel, and we would actively support an organization that unquestionably is engaged in doing a mitzvah, a good deed, by helping those in need at their time of need, but not stopping there and actually helping them get on their feet so they are more independent and self-reliable in the future. As has been typical in recent years, IsraAID was one of the first organizations to get out to the Bahamas immediately after the hurricane struck. It has volunteers on the ground providing emergency supplies and supporting long-term support projects. With us today are Seth David, the Executive Director of the organization in the United States, and Shira Goldstein, who will be replacing Michal Bar. Shira is the current head of the IsraAID mission in the Bahamas. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping points. The format of the webinar today is that of questions that I will pose to the panel. We'll be showing in the background some images as we speak, and we ask for the attendees to send out any questions to the panel before the session, which we will be adding as well. If you also have questions, please use the chat window within the webinar panel, and make sure you send it to the panelists only, not to all attendees. Time permitting, we'll get to these as well. We'll also be recording the webinar, so people will have access to it after the session has ended. And we do have a short session today, so I will immediately go over to Seth. Seth, before we start, for those who are not familiar, can you just give us a quick overview of what IsraAID is, who they are, and what they do?
Sure. First, good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Jonathan Bar-Sadeh, and to the whole team of America-Israel Friendship League for inviting us today. We're actually reporting here from Grand Bahama, one of the two major affected areas. So we'll take it a step back. IsraAID was formed 18 years ago, back in 2001, in Israel by big-hearted people that wanted to go help after disasters, mainly volunteers. And over the years, it's turned into the largest humanitarian aid NGO out of Israel that's non-governmental, non-political. Until date, we've been to 52 countries, and we've served over 5 million people in need. We have 3 areas of expertise that all derive from Israel-based know-how. One is mental health, psychosocial support, which deals with mental health and trauma reduction, helping children deal with trauma and the families. The second is WASH, water sanitation, hygiene. And the third area is medical missions. We work hand in hand with the Israeli government that send search and rescue teams many times. And we work obviously with other NGOs in the space and part of the whole cluster system. We're funded mainly by institutional partners and private donors. That makes up kind of our NGO and how we operate. And we're really the boots on the ground. When disasters happen, we send teams that come, assess quickly, and work with the locals to really build back communities.
Thanks, Seth. Shira, you got there just after the hurricane struck. Can you sort of describe to us what did you find?
Sure. So in both Abaco and Grand Bahama, there's a marked amount of physical damage. The water rose over 30 feet in both of these islands, and as the Bahamas are quite flat, 30 feet actually ended up covering almost the entirety of the island chains that make up the Bahamas. In Abaco, it's considered to be 100% destroyed, meaning there are no buildings that are left untouched. Most people have fled as a result. Many of them are living in home shelters, semi-permanent spaces. Excuse me. Yes, exactly. So you can see the kind of physical destruction and damage. Some people have remained as they tried to pick up the pieces of what is left over from their houses, but for most people that is not an option. On Grand Bahama, which is where we are now, about 70% of the infrastructure was destroyed, meaning some people are able to stay, but for the most part, they've scattered as they've tried to figure out their next steps. And you can see here, the IsraAID team was working in the warehouse in the first days. We were accepting donations. We were working with the local partner, the Grand Bahama Disaster Relief Foundation, sorting through the shiploads of containers that were coming in with supplies and trying to distribute them in a very equal and fair manner to all of the people of the Bahamas that were in need.
Thank you. So from a practical perspective, how do you get to the more remote areas?
So some of them are by helicopter, some of them are by boat. The Grand Bahamas, because the water between the islands very often are so shallow, what's necessary is to drive as far as the road allows you to drive, and then to hire a fisherman or someone else who has a boat that's still intact and take a shallow bottom boat out to the surrounding keys, out to the most affected areas, and just reach them however you can.
Okay. Seth, when a disaster strikes, how does IsraAID basically go to the disaster area? How do you decide what kind of disaster attracts your attention?
Yeah, so basically our organization, through our board, decided that we respond to two types of disasters, which are mainly natural hazards by the weather, or man-made disasters, refugee crises. We don't, for instance, respond to Amazonas if it's ecological, for instance, or small. There's disasters all the time, all over the world, with small floodings, etc. It usually has to be very catastrophic and bring the whole community to disarray. We then have a whole process where we define if we really feel we can help the people, what we call bounce back. So if they're at this level, we want to help them to get even back to a higher level with our expertise levels. And then we send teams fairly quickly. We've also gone to countries that don't have diplomatic ties with Israel, like Indonesia, or Sri Lanka, or even North Iraq in the past. So if we feel we can help and have local NGOs or governmental agencies that will work with us, then we send teams. And once we're on the ground, we're very quick to assess what kind of team we will need and what kind of experts we need to send. Engineers or psychosocial support experts, etc. So as I speak to you now, what people don't know is they think that we're like really famous being one of the first in, which is true, but I think we should become more famous to being one of the last out, because we're actually operating, as we speak to you, in 14 countries around the world. We're still operating in Guatemala, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Dominica, and many countries that were affected 1, 2, 3, 4 years ago. And we hire local people and still have experts building back these communities. And that's really, really important, creating sustainable solutions for the long term.
Thanks. So Shira, once you get out to the field, I think Seth already covered some of this, but why don't you just describe to us a bit of the practicalities of what is it that you do?
Sure, so I will use this emergency as a very key example. In general, we take assessments initially because we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually necessary and is needed by the community. And the assessments can be door to door, it can be working with governments, it can be working with partners. We really try to base the information off of what communities themselves are requesting and how they see their own recovery playing out. We know that these assessments are necessary, and we are also trying to respond at the same time. So very often we look for, like as you can see, our team in the warehouse, ways to provide the essentials right away, non-food items, non-perishable foods, blankets, things to help people rebuild their lives, as we're looking for longer term programs that can really, as Seth said, help to build back better and not only be a short-term response. In this case, water and sanitation is a huge issue, as well as the issue of a lot of children that are really highly affected. So knowing that we have a specialty in both mental health and psychosocial support and in water and sanitation, we use what we know as our added value and our specialties and try to really fit ourselves in where the communities themselves identify the highest need being.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of work over there that goes on in all those assessments, and you don't just go out and start handing out canned food. How is this, disaster different from the others that you've come across?
So geographically, there are actually a lot of very interesting constraints for us. So for example, in the water and sanitation program, the logistics is actually proving to be quite complicated. I just came from Mozambique. I was there for the last few months, and even though it also suffered a massive hurricane, a lot of flooding, very similar weather patterns to this disaster that we are currently in, the actual challenges were much different because we were able to move aid around, we were able to create access to water points as needed because we're in a landlocked country. The Bahamas are as a nation made up of 700 very teeny tiny islands spread out in this stunning vista. And as a result, getting access to people that really need it is quite difficult due to the geographical constraints. And I would say that has really set the tone for how it is that we are working with the communities to try to find those that really do need the help and also try to do it in a way that's systematic.
Okay. So I think oftentimes, immediately after disasters, for the first few weeks, we hear a lot about tons and tons of organizations that get out there. Seth, how does IsraAID interact with all of these other organizations that, all in all, they're all out there to try to help?
So it's actually pretty fascinating. Over the last decade, there's been a lot of advancement in the aid and relief world. We call it coordination. That's the key word. And people come together, the governments and other agencies, if it's UN or FEMA in the US, put together what's called a coordinating meeting, which actually I attended yesterday here in the Bahamas. And people share what they're doing, and it's in different clusters. Some are dealing with shelter, some with food, some with protection of the children. And basically, we sit in multiple sectors and share knowledge, and people work in different areas or know they could bring in different facets. And this way, there's no overlap or waste of resources, basically. So that's how it kind of works in the system. And it's interesting and fascinating how some of the biggest relief organizations in the world recognize IsraAID already from other disasters. So Shira mentioned Mozambique. Shira also led a mission to India with the floods last year, or was in Nepal. And I'm surprised how many times we're in these forums and people walk up to us and say, wow, I remember you from Nepal or Japan, and you did amazing work there. So it's pretty phenomenal to see every time.
How big is the organization really? And how does it compare to some of these other organizations size-wise?
So I think what we bring to the table is kind of what Israel brings. If Israel is the startup nation, we're the social startup nation. So we're 300 employees globally. We've kind of quadrupled in the last 4 years. And 80% of our employees are actually local hires. We hire local people to work with international experts, a lot from Israel. And basically, we work hand in hand to build back and integrate these programs into those local cultures. We have experts in each one of our sectors that help set the best practices and work with people in these various countries to embed these programs. So that's kind of how the infrastructure of the organization is. And the fact that we have partners like UNICEF or World Bank is a big deal. And also, we must remember UNICEF is a UN agency, and they're very proud to work with an Israeli-based humanitarian aid organization. That in itself is a big success story.
So basically, it sounds as if you're actually promoting the name of Israel just by with some organizations that are not traditionally known to be pro-Israel.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have shifted their opinions about Israel or Israelis as people by seeing the work. And sometimes the best way to shift people's misconceptions or beliefs is just to see it and see it in person. And in many places we've deployed. In fact, this time last year, we were with teams in North Carolina and Florida and the panhandles that were hit by Florence and Michael, the two hurricanes. And even there, they never met a person from Israel in their lives. So in many places around the world, it helps to bridge people. We have three main missions, which is three components to our mission: saving lives, building back communities, and the third one is bridging people. And we say bridging people, it's everywhere and between everybody. So that's kind of, it's a big outcome of our work. It's not why we do it, but it's very authentic and organic, and it really builds what we call soft diplomacy.
Okay, thank you. Shira, what's the most difficult obstacle that you came across over here in the Bahamas?
To be quite honest, I think it's the totality of the destruction. Usually when we're working in places, there's at least enough of an infrastructure that we can go based upon what's left. Here and in Abaco, there really isn't a whole lot left. And so we're trying to work with communities, and we're trying to do it in a way that is in conjunction with those communities and is empowering to them internally, but it's proving to be physically difficult as very often these communities are just no longer in existence. So it's trying to take what we know how to do best and function within an environment that even for themselves is wholly unprecedented in terms of the complete destruction of an entire island, an entire subset of a nation.
Any light asides? Any light aside stories that you can share?
I'll share two stories. So, we spent the last 2 days, we visited a lot of shelters where the families were evacuated to. And it's really interesting for me. When I got into the NGO space about 12 years ago, I grew up in Ashkelon, and I remember going to shelters in Ashkelon, seeing the kids, being in shelters when the rockets were coming in. And it's interesting that the tools that were being used on my young niece at the time, art therapy and drama therapy, is similar tools that we use around the world after disasters in shelters to create what we call child-friendly spaces. So with us on the team are actually team members, the head of social services for a Bedouin community in the South, a psychologist actually from what we call the envelope of Gaza. So it's actually interesting that the same professionals that help the children in Israel could come around the world and bring this know-how. So it really kind of surfaced emotions on my end to see their struggles and remember where we came from and how it's actually turned into a positive around the world. And the second story is, I went 2 nights ago near the hotel to grab dinner, and it was like this kind of karaoke place. They like here karaoke, so whoever comes out to Bahamas, you have to prepare in advance. And I started talking to the locals, and the bartender is actually a single mother that moved from Grand Bahama with her 2 children, and she's staying with family. She just registered her kids to a local school, and she started working there a week ago. She found a job where she could start rebuilding her life. She knows it's temporary for a few months, but she had to do something and quickly to upkeep the family. And then she shared with me how she was in the house when the floods and the hurricane hit, and it was rising to a level where she basically put both of her kids inside the ceiling in the level, and she was standing on the stove, and the water stopped literally at the neck level. And on one hand, she was dancing and smiling and full of life, more than most people I've ever met. And on the other hand, she was sharing the story and breaking down, and this mix of emotion is very difficult to absorb. We see many times it could take 6 months to a year for people really to understand what kind of trauma they've been through and how they need to bring it out and get help to bounce back. But it was really interesting to hear and see how quickly people try to be resilient and find solutions. And she didn't want to ask for help. She wants to succeed by herself. So that was very heartwarming for myself. I don't know if you want to share a story with the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting stories that we always come across in many of our places is when you have physical destruction after a natural disaster, the burden is very often placed on the mothers, the wives, and the older women of the community to take care of their families. And with the water and sanitation program, what we're trying to do is trying to limit that burden. So for example, there's a woman that we had spoken to trying to, in our efforts to do these assessments, to really understand where these water points should be, how to create access to the communities in the way that they need them. One of the women said that she'd been walking over an hour every single day in each direction just to get water. And they carry water in these little jerry cans, and the jerry cans are about 2 gallons each. So for an entire family, she would spend half of her day just walking back and forth to try to get water from an access point that was quite far away from her house. And when we told her that we were bringing in a new access point that would actually be within about 15 minutes from her house, the emotions that she displayed were, one of extreme gratitude. And it's those kinds of serious impacts that you can see that allows her to then spend more time with her family. It allows her to spend more time rebuilding her own home. And it may seem like something quite simple, such as just adding 1 extra access point, but for her and her family, it was going to make all the difference. So those are the stories that we carry with us in terms of providing the strength and the ongoing motion.
Gives you the strength to carry on.
Yeah.
So really talking about carry on, Seth, how long would you stay in a place like the Bahamas, and what do you see the organization leaving in the field? I mean, what's the legacy?
So look, each country is different. We've already created a significant legacy, I believe, and I've seen it around. We've met with multiple ministries and ministers the last few days, and there's already projects, but we look for long-term, and long-term depends on quite a few factors. One is the local community needing us. Number two is having the right partners. And number three is really seeing gaps that we have know-how that we could help fill in. And then the fourth thing, and the most significant, is funding to pay for it, because a lot of people are very emotionally driven when the disaster hits. We say media attention equals donor attention. So as we speak now, it's pretty much shifting off the news, Dorian hurricane. And in 3 months, I don't know how many people are really gonna think about how do I help build our resilience within the school network, or how do I create housing that's more up to code and resilient. We actually just came from a university of the Bahamas that had category 5 windows, and they were all shattered. And the whole backyard, there's actually a car in the middle of the center of the university. And even then, it's never enough. So basically, those factors together define if we could stay. For instance, we had a local partner in Dominica that was hit 2 years ago, and we just signed a deal for another 5 years. We're going to be 7 years in total in Dominica. We're helping all 73 schools in the island to build higher enhanced levels of resilience, and also an accelerator for youth for workforce development. So we're now assessing, as we speak, we're doing this work of capacity building for counselors, for teachers, with the various ministries to do child-friendly spaces. People will be in shelters anywhere between the next month to 6 months. We're doing a lot of wash solutions. As Shira explained, we're putting water bladders in different locations so they have safe water. And we're actually doing that with the Foreign Ministry of Israel that just came in to help as well. That's fantastic. And we're going to continue to assess where the needs are.
Okay. So, question for both of you. What keeps you up at night?
I think my main concerns are, first, to ensure that my team is healthy and safe, because I'm bringing in a number of people from all over the world, and it is my joy and responsibility to ensure that they are healthy and happy. And then it's just trying to understand, while we are here, what can we actually do in the best way possible that's responsible and ethical and needed. And just trying to fit all the moving pieces together, that after an emergency, all these complex layers of things that it feels like day to day, hour to hour, are constantly changing. Trying to collate all this information and ensure that what we do is actually the best that we can do.
Seth?
Wow, a lot of things keep me up. But I'd say one of the things that keeps me up is how we stay united. And we focus on too many negative things in life, and I think we should focus on the positives, because when we come together, a lot could be achieved. And sadly, we say disasters also opportunities. We see in all these areas that are affected, even in Israel, when war hits, how the whole community comes together as one and really is stronger and more resilient. So, we're always trying to think how that can happen in normalcy, not just during a disaster.
So, thank you. So just before as we wrap up, it's time for a couple of questions from the audience over here. One question is, with the increased amount of natural disasters now, I don't want to say whether or not it's from climate change, I want to get into that question, but as we're seeing more and more natural disasters occurring, how is IsraAID basically thinking about scaling its efforts or adjusting the mission?
So we're putting a lot of thought about, and it is climate change and population density, obviously, that's leading to a lot of this, in addition to man-made disasters. But we are building a strategic plan now for 5 years. We do see ourselves quadrupling again, and we know our capacity has to be bigger. We need to have more expertise, be working more on white papers and research and sharing our knowledge to scale it up. Just like one does with software with open source. So we want to open source some of our methodologies, and that's part of the process we're going through, how to do it. And just like a business, an NGO has to go from a process of being a startup to middle size to a large corporation. And I think that's kind of where we are.
Interesting. Go Go ahead.
I just like to add on to that from the perspective of being in country short term or long term. Many of these countries that we're in, the emergencies are going to be repeated. Right? In the Bahamas, unfortunately, we know this is not the last time they're going to face a hurricane. In Nepal, definitely not the last time they're going to have an earthquake. So I think a big part of what we do and what we build into all of our programs and into the effort that we try to increase the capacity of our national staff and to build the awareness and the systems within the country is knowing that in the future, these countries that we have responded to, unfortunately, probably will face the same problems. And so we try to leave behind as many skills, coordination mechanisms, all this increased capacity that we can. So if there is another emergency in their country, they're able to respond to it. I can give you one really brief example of this. Leaving from Nepal, I was there for the last 2 years. And our organization was there for over 4 years after the devastating earthquake that hit the Kathmandu Valley and many other regions of the Himalayas in Nepal. We built an amazing local team. Towards the end, for the last year and a half, I was the only international staff. My staff of 20 were all Nepali. And towards the end of my term there was massive flooding in the south. We were able to completely mobilize from within our own internal team who had experience of responding to disasters. We're able to coordinate with all actors, work with international partners, and actually launch an internal emergency response from the team that was built within Nepal. And for us, that's like the ideal, right? To make sure that we can work and provide our expertise where and when needed, but that these skills are actually embedded within the staff and the people that we work with.
So basically, in your ideal world, in 20 years from now, there will be no need for IsraAID because you will have established and enabled local communities to help themselves.
I mean, I think asking about need, it's a very tricky question, right? Because ideally, I'm a public health specialist. Yes, ideally, I would love to work myself out of a job. But unfortunately, we know that that's not the reality. As these things continue to worsen, as populations continue to grow, I think it's a matter of being smart about understanding how we can continue to add our value and how we can continue to work with these teams that we've already created.
Great.
I'll just add, we always work with local NGOs and government agencies nearly everywhere we go. So here in the Bahamas, we're working with NEMA, the Emergency Department, Ministry of Education, Youth, Culture, Sports, and Social Services, and the Health. And so it's a lot of coordination when we do it, and everything is done highly ethically and morally and with a lot of respect and a lot of delicacy of how it's approached.
Okay, great. So one last question as we wrap up is basically, how can we help?
So I think people first to donate, because we can't all come and volunteer and we're not all needed as volunteers. So whatever we could do in the communities, we had schools that did baking honey cakes and just, showing that they cared. Even, if it collects $150, it's more of a statement that we care for other people. People could sign up to join our roster. We have a volunteer roster where, you never know where you'll be called on. It could be to help get people back into their homes. Anyone above 18 could do that, also in the USA. Or it could be psychosocial therapist or education background or logisticians. You never know what type of profession we may need. We also educate people and host certain webinars on these topics if people care deeply about it. And we also have a team program for schools and for students to learn more about it. So any of the above is just to be an ambassador and to care. We always care deeply when it hits in our backyard, but we must care in all backyards just as much.
Okay, and with that, I want to thank you very much. You guys are doing a wonderful job out there. Good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us today. Thank you.
Bye.